In this lecture, we're going to learn about mixins. They're a way to reuse logic within components. Reusability can make your code more readable and manageable. Vue offers a solution called Mixins to help you with reusability. Let's explore how to use mixins. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the Mixins documentation page. Here is what Vue says about them. Mixins are a flexible way to distribute reusable functionalities for Vue components. A mixin object can contain any component options. When a component uses a mixin, all options in the mixin will be mixed into the component's own options. If you have properties similar to one another from component to component, you can use a mixin to prevent yourself from rewriting the same code. It's common to have functions that you want to share amongst many components. Mixins are the perfect solution for this. For this example, we're going to create a mixin that will keep track of the page's scroll offset. We'll add the mixin to a component. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a zip file with the starter files you'll need. Upload it anywhere you'd like. After uploading it, run the npm install command. Lastly, start the server with the dev command. There's nothing much to say about the starter files. Pretty much all of them are the starter files you'll receive if you select the default preset. I've made changes to the app component file. Open it in your editor. In the template, we have two elements called app and scroll position. The app element acts as a container. If we scroll down to the CSS, we'll see that it has relative positioning. We're giving it an abnormally large height. We're using a large height because we want to be able to scroll up and down the page to view the results. The scroll position element has a fixed position. We want to be able to see it whenever we scroll. We want to see it because it'll contain an expression that'll output the scroll offset. You'll see what it looks like in a moment. First, we need to create the scroll properties. We'll be creating it in a mixin. In the source directory, create a file called mixin.js. Inside the file, we'll export an object. Mixins don't work on their own. They're not meant to. They are objects that will merge with an instance of Vue or a component. The options we create in a mixin must match the option names in a component's options object. If we want to create data, then we'll need to create a data function, so on and so forth. We're going to create a data property for storing the scroll offset. Define the data function inside the mixin. Add a property called offset. Set its initial value to 0. The offset will be 0 because that's the initial value the browser will assign the offset to. We want to be able to update the offset whenever the user scrolls on the page. The browser emits an event we can listen to for when this occurs. We'll start listening for the event when the component is mounted. Define the mounted lifecycle function. Inside the function, we'll listen to the event by calling the window.addEventListener function. The name of the event is called scroll. If the event is emitted, we'll call the this.update function. This function isn't defined. Let's define it next. Add the methods object to the mixin. Define the update function. Lastly, we'll set the offset data property to the window.pageyOffset property. We have a mixin for keeping track of the offset of the page. We'll want to merge this mixin with the app component. This can be done by registering a mixin. We can register a mixin locally or globally. Let's start with a local mixin. Back in the app component file, we'll import the mixin file. To register the object as a mixin, we need to add the mixin's property to the component's configuration object. The mixin's property needs to be set to an array. The array should be the objects that you would like merged with the component. In our case, we want to merge the scroll mixin object. We'll pass that in. The properties and methods from the mixin will be accessible via the this keyword. We can treat them as if they were the component's options to begin with. We'll want to display the offset in the template. We have a div tag with the class scroll position. It's empty. Let's add an expression inside it. The expression will be set to offset. Let's check out the application in the browser. If I scroll up and down, the expression will be updated with the scroll offset. Even though the code wasn't written in the component, Vue merged the mixin with the component's options. Mixins allow us to reuse code by outsourcing the logic into a separate object. We can add this mixin to any component. There are a couple of things to be aware of when using mixins. Firstly, an instance or component's options will always have priority. Let's look at an example by switching back to the editor. Let's create a data function in the app component file. Inside the object, we'll add a property called offset. Its value will be 0. The mixin already has an offset data property. Vue will use the property in the component. The mixin's version of the property will not be merged with the component. This doesn't mean the other methods we have in the mixin will not get included. The update method will get merged with the component because the component doesn't have it defined. Another thing worth noting is that components don't share mixin data. For instance, if I were to register the mixin with another component, it won't share the offset data property with the app component. They'll be treated as independent properties in their respective components. We don't have to worry about things leaking from one component to the next. One component does not influence any other component's data even if they're registering the same mixin. The mixin's properties are duplicated. All components will have a unique version of the data. One last thing worth noting is how lifecycle functions are treated. If a mixin and component have the same lifecycle function defined, they'll both run. Let's look at an example. Inside the app component file, we're going to add the mounted lifecycle function. We'll log a message that says the following: app mounted lifecycle function. The mixin is already defining the mounted lifecycle function. When it comes to lifecycle functions, Vue will push both methods into an array where both functions are called. Let's view the browser to see what happens. If I scroll up and down the page, the offset will continue to get updated. This can only happen if the mounted function from the mixin was called. Let's open the console to see if the message is logged. We'll find that the component's mounted lifecycle function was called. If a component defines a lifecycle function, it'll get called along with the mixin's lifecycle function. This gives us the opportunity to define lifecycle functions without them conflicting with another freely. Mixins can be useful for generating generic functions that can be shared across multiple components. While mixins are great, there are a few issues with them. Let's discuss what those issues are to discover why the development team behind Vue decided to create the composition API. The biggest problem with the Mixin API is namespace clashing. We have an example in our project. The offset data property in the component clashes with the mixin. We don't get an error from Vue or the editor about the problem. Vue will make an assumption. It'll assume the data property in the component should be used. But what if we wanted to use the offset in the mixin? Well, that's not possible unless we change the names. If we want to prevent clashing from happening, we'll have to look inside the Mixin file to discover what property names are taken. The Mixin doesn't directly tell us what gets added. We have to peek inside the Mixin file to discover what gets added to the component. This problem can be amplified if you have multiple Mixins registered to a component. Not only will you have to check if a component has any clashing names, but you'll also need to check with the other Mixins. Vue will not tell you if there are namespace collisions. Mixins can easily override one another. It's for this reason that Mixins are problematic. It's challenging to develop a system that will tell you when you have namespace clashing with Mixins. You can avoid this issue by opening the files and checking the names manually, but it's something that can be easily overlooked during development. The Composition API is much better at handling this issue. With that said, let's learn about the Composition API. We'll look at how this issue is resolved in the next set of lectures.